I think our national media has become the stenographers of terrorists. Now that it is Jewish women who have been mass raped by the biggest barbarians left on the planet, suddenly they've rediscovered the journalistic ethics. Well, is there evidence? What is the evidence? Let's look here, let's look there. Did you see it? Have you seen it? Is there a video?
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I'll break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and its impact on world Jewry with a conversation about the role that the media plays in slanting the news about the war, as well as in helping to foment the surgent anti-Semitism, with journalist and author Batya Ungar-Sargon. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can see us on Telegram. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content there, by subscribing. And now to today's program. Israelis are used to being treated unfairly by the international community, and even those American Jews who felt the most secure about their community knew that the world, in Darrell Horn's prescient formulation, loves dead Jews, but is lukewarm at best about live ones, especially those with power and who seek to defend themselves. But even so, the speed with which the world flipped the script after the Hamas atrocities on October 7th was shocking. Within hours, even before the Israel Defense Forces began its campaign to try to eliminate Hamas, the drumbeat of invective directed at the Jewish state that sought to delegitimize its right of self-defense and to depict its counterattacks against the terrorists as war crimes had begun. And since then, the incitement against Israel and the spread of false charges that it is committing genocide in Gaza, or specifically targeting civilians, and especially children, has only increased with each passing day. There are a number of reasons that explain the willingness of so many to believe that Israel is morally equivalent to the terrorists of Hamas, or who buy into the notion that the conflict is about its bad behavior and the occupation. The spread of ideologies like intersectionality and critical race theory that falsely assert a link between the Palestinian war to destroy the one Jewish state on the planet and the struggle for civil rights in the United States are a huge part of the problem. These toxic woke ideas provide a permission slip for anti-Semitism, and the indoctrination of a generation of youth has created a generational divide over Israel. But we cannot ignore the role a biased media plays in the campaign to demonize Israel. The willingness of so many Americans to believe the Palestinian narrative, in which they are the blameless victims of oppression resisting Israel, doesn't come out of nowhere. It's based on reporting and commentary that buys into the lies told by Hamas. That's partly a matter of their health ministry, supplying the press with wildly exaggerated figures that don't separate the Hamas combatants from civilians, but it's also rooted in a willingness to believe the worst about Israel and to treat innocent Israelis subjected to mass murder in their homes and at a music festival, or gang rape, or kidnapped as morally equivalent to the Palestinian terrorists that have been released as part of the hostage negotiations. It's a matter of never asking Palestinians, both in the Middle East and America, if they are willing to live in peace with the Jewish state, no matter where its borders are drawn, or if they support Hamas terrorism, as sadly the vast majority of them do. How do they routinely point out the occupation that Hamas and its supporters oppose is that of Jews over any part of their historic homeland, since their goal is the destruction of Israel and the genocide of its people, not a redress of grievances. It's also a matter of never giving an honest account of the history of the conflict. An ordinary reader of the New York Times or Washington Post, or someone who watches the broadcast networks or most cable news outlets, would never know that the Palestinians have repeatedly rejected offers of peace for the last 75 years, including those that would have given them statehood in 2000, 2001, and 2008, or that the supposedly moderate Palestinian Authority subsidizes terrorism through its pay-to-slay program and cheered the October 7th atrocities rather than opposing them. Why do journalists fail to tell the truth about Israel and Hamas? It's partly the result of ignorance, laziness, and sloppiness, as most of the press neither knows much about the conflict and prefers to tell the story in the easiest way by picking an underdog and telling it from their point of view, regardless of the facts. But it's also a matter of that same woke ideology that has played such a destructive role in our culture and politics. It created a new generation of journalists who see themselves primarily as activists in the service of intersectional ideology and not seekers of objective truth. Moreover, the news business, in its currently bifurcated form, has profited from the urge to divide people, and by aiding the left's obsession with race, has not only hurt the interests of working-class people, but also enabled anti-Semitism through its promotion of critical race theory and intersectionality. To discuss how the media reports the conflict in this manner and why it does so, I'm very pleased to have with us one of the brightest young journalists in America today, as well as the author of one of the finest books ever written about how the press operates. Batya Ungar-Sargon is opinion editor of Newsweek and a columnist at Compact magazine, and before that, the opinion editor at The Forward. She's the author of Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Batya Ungar-Sargon, welcome back to Top Story.
Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciate your op-eds for Newsweek. I just have to tell you, I don't know if your listeners know how often you write for us, but it's not just that you write so well and so intelligently. It's that you're so game to participate in our daily debate, which is really our flagship program at Newsweek Opinion, where we try to feature two sides of a single story. It is so dear to our hearts and so important in terms of the public sphere. And I'm just so grateful to you. And just one more thing on this, which is, sometimes you ask people to write for Daily Debate and they give you kind of like the party line. But you always manage to write something that is so smart and so above that and really gives the populist point of view that most times I share with you, but in a way that really elevates it. And you always come up with things I never would have thought of. So I'm so super grateful to you. And I am so thrilled to be here to be able to join you in your space on your turf. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Batya, thanks very much. I do appreciate that. It's fun to be writing for Newsweek, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of that debate. We have, I thought you were going to mention that sometimes you've asked me stuff, and I turned it around pretty quickly. I think once while I was on vacation in Italy.
Yes, true.
You sent me an email. While I was having dinner before going to the opera and in Milan, and I was like, well, I'll get it to you later.
And you did. You went to the opera, and then you wrote for Daily Debate.
Yes, I did. Okay. Well, our readers, our listeners, now we'll get to the main stuff. But thank you, and it's great to have you on. I want to start by asking you to give us an overview of how the mainstream media is covering Israel's war with Hamas. Do you think the coverage has been fair, or where do you think it's failed?
I think our national media has become the stenographers of terrorists. So I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's good. But I do think it's exactly what you would have expected if you've been reading the New York Times or watching CNN or, following along with their coverage of pretty much anything over the last 10 years. So I wasn't surprised, but it's still shocking to see. Why are they not embarrassed? It's not just that there's no shame about their insistence that Hamas get the benefit of the doubt, like again and again and again. But Hamas reveals them to be terrible journalists every week and reveals them to be liars every week. And they, like, why are they not embarrassed? Like, you would think, okay, give Hamas the benefit of the doubt once, shame on me, like, but
Yeah.
no, it's repeated and it's shameless, and it's really, really
You'd almost
awful.
think that there was a pattern there, right?
Right, exactly. Just total abdication of not just journalistic ethics, but any sense of morality, any sense that there is an objective way to tell whether something is true or false or good or bad, out the window because of woke mind virus.
I'd like to focus for a moment on the coverage of the hostages. It's natural, even understandable, that journalists would focus on the human interest angle of any story, since that is something that most people can relate to most easily. But has the focus on the hostages and the efforts of this kidnapping victims' family to prioritize their plight and the need to free them over Israel's broader security dilemmas been in no small measure the reason why events have played out, not just in Israel, but here in the United States, as they have? So in this sense, journalists are not just covering the news, but they're actually helping to shape or even make it.
Are you referring to the way in which the effort to save the hostages has always been in a fundamental tension with Israel's military goals of destroying Hamas? Is that what you're referring to?
I think that's part of it, but it's also, it's as I'm trying to take an overview of how everything is played out. That became the one thing that I think the mainstream media here was willing to talk about on the Israel side. And it has become really the sole focus. And I think it really has helped shape, how the news, not just how events have gone. I think that's certainly true in Israel, but I think to some extent it's influenced American policy too.
It's very interesting because after the dust settled and I started to try to understand like what had fundamentally happened here, it seemed to me unthinkable that the hostages were alive. And so I greeted the calls for their release with a sort of like heartbreak and of thinking this is so, how could they possibly still be alive? Look at Gaza City. And then, of course, the horror of their rescue being in tension with Israel's military goals with this operation, which is to protect its citizens forever from Hamas. And so when I would see these families of these hostages, there was a part of me that felt like, how could they not realize like that they're never going to see these people again? And I was, of course, completely wrong about this, like completely and utterly wrong about it, for which I thank God. I mean, I my God, like what a thing to have been wrong about. And but I think even now, if you follow the Israeli media, I've been watching Mako just nonstop. The jubilation is so tinged with sadness and horror, and so many of the family members who came home still have family members who are in Gaza. So many children came home to find out that they were orphans. There were very few just sort of pure happy endings. And I think that pathos is very much lost on the American media, who just sees this as who have been trying very much to create a false equivalence between the return of the Israeli civilian hostages, many of them, all of the returnees so far, women and children, and then the release of these Palestinian convicted criminals, essentially, is what they are. A few of them who have been released were in, detention without any kind of charges against them. But many of them were people who had attempted murder and pled down, right, because that was supposed to be excluded from the list. And I think that sort of false equivalence is very, it's again, it's like you would think it would be so obvious, like don't write a headline that suggests that these are in any way comparable. the release of the victims of a mass murder and mass rape and mass mutilation torture campaign on the one hand, and then people who would have loved to engage in such a disgusting, horrific terrorist act, yet were unable to do so due to their own limitations, right? Mm-hmm. So I think to me, that's sort of how I've been experiencing it, just the total moral equivalency. And Shani Moore had a wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal where he really explained what's happening here, which is that, in the woke mindset, it's not just that people who have less power are inherently virtuous, although that's a huge component of it, which is why they fundamentally side with Hamas, even when they don't admit it. There's a part of them that can't help but give Hamas the benefit of the doubt because they see them as less powerful than Israel. That's when they aren't actually drooling over Hamas militants on Twitter, as one has seen recently. But it's that they have no agency. So when they do bad things, the agency behind those activities has to be reassigned. And it gets reassigned to the most proximate white person, right, who in the sick woke mind virus is Israel. And so they have to now accuse Israel of crimes worthy of having generated October 7th. And I think that's what you're really seeing here is attempts to dehumanize the families of the hostages. But I'm curious specifically what you mean by how the hostages have shaped the coverage in the media and what you think that has come at the expense of, or how you think it has done that, and if you think that that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, I think, I'm trying to be as objective as I can in looking at the events, how they do it. And it's occurred to me, and it's partly, this is Israel supporters, they have focused, we have focused, as a group, as Jews, on the hostages, on their fate, whether we thought, that they could be saved or not. And that became the focus. And it sort of became the petard on which, Israel's government is being hoisted on. Because if the hostages are the main issue, and their safe return, which, obviously, if you're a family member, what wouldn't we do, any of us, to get a family member, safe? If it's your child, you change, you trade the whole world for your child's safety. And in essence, whereas, I think, in sort of past conflicts where the focus was sort of on the macro issue, like, are the bad guys going to be punished or not? Right. Is Hamas, the question became not, is Hamas going to get away with mass murder, but are we going to save the hostages? And in the end, it's obviously, along with everything else, plays into Hamas's hands. And, I don't know whether that's avoidable or not, but I do know that the media is part of it because then it's our natural tendency to treat everything as a human interest story. And the hostages are a human interest story. The question of whether Hamas gets away with mass murder is much more dense. It's much, it's not as easy to understand. And so that's the story that I think most of the media tells.
I think I felt relieved that they found some Jews that they could feel sympathetic toward, and I think
there's that. Yes.
And I think it's irrelevant whether the American media thinks the murderers will be punished for mass murder. I don't care what any American politician or media outlet thinks about that. I think that that's a question for the Israelis to decide, and I think they have decided the answer is going to be no. And so I'm not too worried about what the media says. I mean, I'm not too worried about the media in general because I think they have made themselves irrelevant with their woke sociopathy. So I feel more sanguine that, with every passing day, that is more clear and more obvious to more people who are still holding on and thinking, oh, surely the mainstream media is not justifying mass murder. No, they are. And so I feel like I'm less bothered by that. And I do think that it seemed to me almost surprising that they were willing to cover the hostages at all, given the way the rest of their coverage shakes out.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, the willingness of many supposedly credible journalists to treat, as you said before, Hamas's claims as credible, or to fail to adequately explain its goals or how widespread its support is, or even to place this in the context of the history of the conflict is, I think, a major problem. But why do you think journalists are doing this? Is this ignorance, laziness, sloppiness, or, as I think you've already sort of raised, is this ideology and bias that provides the main explanation?
There's a really good quote from some Soviet, I forget who it was. And the quote is, "For my friends, mercy, for my enemies, the law," right? And you're really seeing that. And I'm going to start with an example and then explain what I mean by that. Throughout the Me Too era, the slightest sexual comment, joke, advance would earn you, the harshest condemnation immediately. Believe all women, believe everything they say. And it doesn't matter how small or innocuous the supposed accusation was, although, of course, we later saw even much bigger accusations being fabricated. But immediately, the journalists saw it as their role not to report in an objective way, but to impose a kind of quote unquote justice on the world, right? Like that their reporting should be in the service of making the world a better place, not objective, but rather full of what they considered to be moral clarity. Now that it is Jewish women who have been mass raped by the biggest barbarians left on the planet, suddenly they've rediscovered the journalistic ethics. Well, is there evidence? What is the evidence? Let's look here. Let's look there. Did you see it? Have you seen it? Is there a video? Right? And it's exactly that rhetoric of, for my friends, mercy, and for my enemies, the law, right? It's not like we don't have a sense of what objective journalism should look like. It's that people only deploy it against people who they see as their enemies. And that is what this moment tells you, is who they see as their friends and who they see as their enemies, or rather who they see themselves as needing to work on behalf of and who they see themselves as needing to work against. The simple explanation is it's just pure anti-Semitism. The Jew is always their enemy. I personally am a little bit fed up with not fed up, God forbid, but I'm not very interested in what is anti-Semitic and what is not. I think for a long time I felt like anti-Zionism was a political position against a political entity, and so it should be separated from anti-Semitism, which can apply to Jews in diaspora who are living, without an army designed to protect them. I now think that that's wrong, only because right now it seems to me that Israelis are actually more vulnerable than I am, and so what difference does it make, or what's at stake in me doing this, this chakira into which is which and which is that? It's almost irrelevant to me. I mean, the question is can you tell right from wrong? I don't need to call somebody a bigot. I don't really care what they are, feel towards a certain group. I care more, do they have an ethical apparatus in their soul? And the problem with people who come out of the American university system is that every minute they spend in a humanities seminar or lecture, they're being taught that there's no difference between right and wrong, because the entire humanities is under the rubric and auspices of postmodernist, postcolonialist critical theory in all of its mutations, which holds that there is no such thing as equality between two people. There is no such thing as right versus wrong. The woke mindset says you replace a worldview based on right versus wrong with a worldview based on powerful versus powerless, and whoever has less power is inherently virtuous, and then they superimpose their very messed up view of what race is onto that. And so you, as a journalist, your job, if you come out of the university system, is not to tell people what is happening in the world and let them make up their own mind based on their values and virtues. It is to try to impose this view on the world that anybody who has less power and can be coded as darker skinned is inherently virtuous, and we should be on their side and lift them up, and they are incapable of evil and they are incapable of agency. And meanwhile, anybody who is coded as white is inherently suspect, inherently suspicious, inherently flawed and problematic in their DNA in a way that is inextricable, just like you can't change your skin color. And therefore, they must be treated with derision and brought down a peg from their pedestal, right? That's the worldview that every minute you spend in a university in the humanities, you are imbibing. And so now that we have a situation, I mean, my whole first book was about how the media, the problem with today's left-wing media is not that it's liberal, it's not that it's left-wing, it's that it's made up of a bunch of people who spent a decade of their lives being inculcated into this extremely disgusting worldview that is against everything we believe as Jews and everything Dr. King wanted for this country. And so that's what the real problem is. They brought this sickness, this mind virus into the newsroom with them, and their bosses and their elders who knew better were too afraid of them to say anything, because we have this on the left, there's this like worship of youth. And of course, it's tied in with technology and, people coming up under you in a profession that's collapsing and there's fewer and fewer jobs and so forth. But, you combine like this worship of youth with this sickness and, all the means of disseminating it now, and all of the people who should have stopped it didn't. Of course, the New York Times, we can talk about this if you want, but it has a long history of being deeply anti-Semitic.
Right.
So this is not new for them at all. They were woke avant la lettre when it came to Jews, that's for sure. That's how I see kind of where the flaws in the media are coming from.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. Now, one of the real conundrums of contemporary American life is, as something you pointed out, the enormous gap between the opinions of those elites who control our pop culture, the academy, as well as the media, and most Americans. It's easy to forget that the mobs chanting from the river to the sea on the streets, on campuses, and now even in some high schools, calling for Israel's destruction, or Rashida Tlaib, or even the Israel bashers at leading newspapers or on cable news, let alone the staffers in the Biden administration that are outraged at Biden's handling of the war, that they're a minority and that most Americans actually support Israel. This is something that you've written and spoken about, but where is this disconnect? Why is this happened? Obviously, you talked about why most young people in the media are this way, but how has this been allowed to persist? Because this is just something that where we see these videos on X. I think both of us were focused on the testimony in Oakland about a resolution condemning Hamas, and these people coming out of nowhere saying all these seemingly crazy things, but they're not necessarily, they're crackpots, but they have influence, and they're more in tune with some of the people in charge of important things than most Americans. Why has this been allowed to persist?
It's funny because a lot of those people at the Oakland City Council, they had TikTok voice. There's a certain voice you get when you spend a lot of time staring at your reflection in your phone and making soliloquies to people in the hopes of getting the Chinese Communist Party to approve enough of you to make it go viral with the algorithm, which is exactly what's happening to a lot of pro-Hamas content. I think the disconnect comes from, the colleges, universities, which trickles down from the elites into, even state schools. I will say I'm curious what you make of this argument. I'm not sure that it's accurate, but that video from the Hillsdale School, is that the one in Queens?
Hillcrest High School, yeah.
High School. That is a school that has had a lot of behavioral issues, instances of students, bullying and attacking and things like that. And I watched that video and I thought, the problem here is not that these kids are quote unquote pro-Palestinian, which they obviously have no idea what that means. The problem is that they are acting like animals. The problem is a behavioral problem. It's not an ideological problem. On college campuses, I think it's sort of the reverse. There's no behavioral problem, which is why I am 100% convinced that Jewish students are not actually unsafe. Because, first of all, leftists are huge physical cowards. I mean, anybody who has been in a room full of leftists knows this. They won't do nobody will take a stand against the group, against the crowd. And they're very physical, they're physical cowards. They're terrified of guns, which is a very good thing because they would probably use them if they had them. So on the university campuses, it's an ideological problem. These people have a sickness in the way that they see the world. In the high schools, it's a behavioral problem. They don't know what they're saying. They're just looking for an excuse to act like children who have grown up, without an authority figure telling them what kind of behavior is okay. So I wouldn't even like, to me, the moral panic around anti-Semitism is extremely important to sort of question. There's, of course, a huge rise in, what we would consider to be like anti-Semitic chanting. I think those chants from the river to the sea, obviously, genocide of Jews, sure. Graffiti, there's been awful instances of graffiti, probably other forms of vandalism. What there hasn't been is, what we had in 2021, which was marauding bands of Palestinians looking for Jews to beat up. We have not seen that. What there hasn't been in what we had in 2019, when hundreds and hundreds of Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, were being beaten up in the streets of Brooklyn. We have not seen that, thank God. And to me, that is the proof of what you're describing, which is the gap, the massive gap between people who are just normal middle-class people, even who might sympathize with the Palestinians, let's say Muslims, like middle-class, middle-aged, shopkeepers, working-class people who understand that they live in a country that has been extremely good to them and is built on religious tolerance. And then, these elites led by the Linda Sarsours of the world and some anti-Zionist Jews, unfortunately, upheld by the squad because they give them cover for their anti-Semitism, egging on university systems and people who have TikTok voice in Oakland. To me, this is very much an elite phenomenon, and the idea of it spreading is it's very hard to see that happening. We know who the working class is. We know who the American middle class is. We know that they have proven immune to this kind of elite nonsense because of the essential inherent good-heartedness of the American people, for which I feel endlessly grateful.
Well, I think there's a lot true. I think if you're asking me, I think there's some real truths in what you said. And, in terms of what's going on college campuses, I think one of the missing elements for me is that, sort of Jews are always sheltering in place rather than standing up for themselves. They're fleeing. Now, that doesn't mean, we need another JDL, on campus of Columbia, where I went a long time ago. But it does mean the Jews have to sort of be kind of in their, they have to show up in numbers and not be intimidated. And, I think we have unnecessarily have been intimidated. I think we're sheltering in place too much and not confronting our opponents, partly because, we're not, we haven't been acculturated to do so. And as far as the high school story, which is something I wrote about this week for JNS, jns.org, please click on it and, read my columns. But, I think, it's, to me, the scandal there, yes, that's a high school with a bad record, with a history of, it used to be a very different kind of high school. But it's still, it's in, they may be just, there's a lot of bad behavior, but it still was bad behavior oriented towards bigotry, towards targeting a Jewish woman for speaking, for expressing her Jewish identity. And the scandal there was the reaction of the school authorities and the Board of Education, the school's chancellor, because if you watched the press conference that he held at the school a week later, after there was only a reaction after the New York Post published something about it, and then belatedly they were willing to speak up. It was all about defending the students and claiming that they weren't radicals, that that nothing to see here. It's just like understand them. They're suffering because they identify with the Palestinian people, and it's sort of like, this is mainstreaming bigotry, So that was, to me, that was the main problem there. And it's related, if the powers that be and the Board of Education of the New York City, the great Jewish city in the world, right, thinks there's nothing really radical about, kids chanting from the river to the sea, whether they understand it or not, and chasing a Jewish teacher out of her classroom, then, that's your anti-Semitism problem in a nutshell.
Yeah, there was a very similar refusal to act from the authorities during 2019, 2020, when all of these from kids were being beaten, and grown-ups and women were being beaten up. Yeah, obviously, like these, the whole, the educational, the leftist liberal educational setup institution from the ground up is deeply flawed by this DEI view, where they only, they didn't rank, to them, Jews don't rank on the scale of oppression and so are not worthy of protection. But I think our response, and I'm sure you agree with me with this, is the problem with DEI and intersectionality is not that they didn't give Jews a high enough ranking. It's that they rank people based on skin color, right?
Right.
Like one way to respond to this.
The whole idea, not where Jews fit in.
Exactly. And in a way, it's sort of our role to be the proof of concept that this is all nonsense. And we should do that proudly.
Yeah. And yet Jews and Jewish organizations, including those tasked with defending Jews, they're defending that. It's like the whole problem with ethnic studies. Problem isn't that Jews don't get their share of the ethnic studies pie. It's that ethnic studies are bad for America. It's bad for the Jews. It plays into anti-Semitism. It doesn't combat it. Yeah. So in your great book, Bad News, you outlined the history of American journalism and showed how the way newspapers covered both issues and politics was generally rooted in their business model. So my question for you is, how is the current tilt against Israel in much of the liberal corporate media explained by this?
Well, who is the New York Times reader, right? Like who, not just the reader, but who is the reader they want, right? Who is the reader they want to be able to tell the third party they're selling that reader's data to, right? Or, LVMH when they want to place an ad, who are they picturing, right? And it's the person who, I remember back when I used to be a New York Times subscriber, in 2019, when I got the New York Times Magazine once, and it had the cover was Angela Davis, an article about like women's power and activism and so forth.
The communist activist, yeah.
The communist activist, anti-Semite.
Mm-hmm.
And on the back cover was a Cartier ad for a Cartier watch. That's the New York Times reader in a nutshell. It's the person sandwiched between, reading about Angela Davis, puff piece about Angela Davis, and then thinking about when they need to buy their next Cartier watch, right? Like that's the New York Times reader. That is not a person who is going to have a problem with seeing numbers quoted by Hamas. And that is who they are targeting because the upper middle class, the top 10%, 20%, but really let's say if the New York Times is looking for that reader, it's the top 10%, these over-credentialed elites who have spent, 4, 8, 12, 16 years in the university system. They are very, very woke, and they see the world through a lens that protects them from having to acknowledge their own privilege, because they still want to see themselves as the heroes. And most importantly, they still want to be able to call their political opponents racists and evil. And so they've developed a worldview to protect them from having to acknowledge their extreme economic privilege. 65% of people living in democratic, I want to get this right because 65% of Americans who make $500,000 or more live in Democrat districts. So that's who we're talking about. And that's who the New York Times reader is. And they inherently are going to have that woke mindset and that woke worldview, because to get into that bracket, you have to have had a certain kind of education and a certain kind of job. And that's what you're going to be looking for in your coverage of the Middle East.
Yeah, I think it plays into, all these broad, that's a great explanation first, but it plays into how, our whole society is sort of turned upside down and so divided, with upper class, working class being completely different. And of course, the parties have sort of flipped on it because the Democrats have somehow become the party of the upper class and not the working class. But I think that plays into it. Now, I think we've discussed the reasons why anti-Semitism is being mainstream, but I think it's still very difficult for many American Jews to wrap their heads around the reality in which they are forced to confront the fact that the threat to their safety is not just, or to be able to live, sort of take part in public life in a way that they feel comfortable is not just from lone wolf nutcase gunmen, but from the fashionable left. in the academy and elsewhere. This is as much a cultural problem as it is one of journalism. But how well do you think we, both in the Jewish world and the secular media, have covered this shift? And is the failure of the media to sort of adequately explain, this, why so many people are so confused about it?
Yeah, there's no one really doing articles about how the art world, which is supposed to be the place of like radicals and independent thinkers and pushing the envelope, have developed this like lockstep, like literally like, goose stepping like Nazis to the tune of Hamas, right? Like nobody's out there explaining how it is that all fiction sounds exactly the same now and has the exact same values. And
if it doesn't get published.
I was going to say that, but then I was going to say, but there are even cancellations of people who are trying so hard to toe the party line and accidentally did something wrong, which are the funniest ones of all. And there's nobody covering that because I think conservatives, they don't really get culture. They're not really invested in it. They're so used to it being this sort of foreign thing. And it developed, again, in this sort of postmodernist way to where a lot of it moved away from being, something that normal people could understand and appreciate. But, so you don't really have that kind of like to get a degree that would get you a job as like a movie critic or a book critic, you have to have been inculcated into the woke mindset. So you wouldn't even notice like how homogenous everything has gotten and how boring and how awful and lame and unwatchable and unreadable. But yeah, there's like that I think is very interesting and something, a musician from Canada had me on his podcast and I kept saying to him, like, how did you manage to break free? And he was like, I don't know, but I do know that it's cost me. Like the fact that he identifies with Israel as like the victim in this situation, like, or as deserving of empathy, like that has cost him as a musician, as an artist. And yeah, somebody should really look into that because that is an astonishing thing that happened in the last. I remember, I was like very, very young in the 80s, but like I had a phase when I was like much older, when I was, in my early 20s, where I was like obsessed with 80s culture. And like, it was so radical. Like people would, take positions on different things. And there were ways in which you could be like, shocking and appalling and still be consumed by the mainstream and push the boundaries about things like that. And you really don't have that anymore. Everybody now is, to make it in these industries, you have to totally toe the line. And we've killed art and we've killed culture. And it does we're not covering it well as a media.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I mean, well, as someone who writes about the arts as well as politics, I think the lockstep, leftism on the way that now every arts company has its own woke DEI commissar to police it is part of what's killing art. And I think just since October 7th, look at the Instagram pages of artists and how few of them, even how few of the Jewish artists have been willing to, speak up and sort of express support for Israel. It's almost like saying that they're for Trump. And those few that do are, sort of they take a lot of flack, and I'm almost afraid to highlight them because if we draw too much attention to them, then they'll be completely canceled. That's part of my, like you always said, well, why don't we do more on that? And I was like, I might really do some harm, by writing about like singling out those Jewish artists because it might go worse for them. So
definitely.
Yeah, I think you've really hit on something there. I think most of the problem, sort of anti-Israel bias is clearly on the left, which is what we've been talking about. But I also want to raise another point here, and that it's true that some very prominent conservative media players, and notably Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, have been, to put it mildly, problematic in their approach to Israel and anti-Semitism. So I'm wondering what you think, since this, how does this fit in to our understanding of how the media operates? Is their decision, sort of to platform Jew haters and to treat the existence of Israel as something worth debating? Is that as rooted in economics as that of left-wing institutions? And, it's sort of, and also I might add, doesn't the refusal of some of their fans, many of whom are Jews, to acknowledge this speak to how loudly partisanship is now the defining characteristic of American life?
It's a really hard question. For Tucker, I really think he's coming at this from this view of America first means isolationism, which is legitimate. It's a legitimate view. I don't agree with it. I think it's very clear. I think Trump had it right. I think, people like Millet and Wilders, as you wrote in your piece, get it right when they see being pro-Israel as a kind of inherent piece of their populism. I think that I can make the case for why America First should include support of Israel. It's really basically fighting one of our three main foes for us, doing most of the work for us, losing the lives for us. But I think for Tucker Carlson, America First really means America only. And I think that there is a legitimate way to make that argument. I have another friend who is, a veteran, and he feels very similarly. He feels like, why are we giving this money to Israel? We shouldn't have given it to Ukraine. We shouldn't be giving it to Israel. I had long debates with him about why I think Ukraine, I also agree we shouldn't have been giving it, but with Israel it's different. But I obviously am not objective. Like, I'm not going to pretend to be objective. And I am constantly asking myself, like, well, was I a hypocrite, like, in saying, why shouldn't Putin be our ally? Like, why shouldn't we enlist Russia to fight China? Like, why would we intentionally poke the bear on behalf of Ukraine? Which, I mean, what are they really bringing to the table for us? But anyway, we don't have to get into that. But
we could do a whole podcast just on Ukraine.
We could do a whole.
I have. But,
yes. But to get back to the right, I think that Candace Owens is actually trying to suggest that that American Jews are a fifth column, and that we are undermining America on behalf of Israel, which is, of course, deeply anti-Semitic and deeply problematic and very wrong, of course, bears noting. And she's not alone. There have been other voices on the right, on the far right, who have been raising questions about October 7th and about the atrocities. And that horseshoe was always there, right? Like, David Duke was always a fan of the Palestinians and always hated Israel. There was, of course, the Richard Spencer version of, racist American ethno-nationalism, where he said, he is a Zionist, right? But by and large, a lot of the fringe right wing hates Israel just like they hate Jews. And it's not surprising to see that emerge. But I think the reason that it is more marginal on the right is because, in general, the elites on the right have a lot less influence because the conservative base is not college educated, and they just have a lot less use for the preening of the elites than the left-wing flank, which is made up by and large of college educated people who see themselves reflected in these conversations and are much more they're it's funny because they're much less skeptical when they are consuming information from sources that they consider to be authoritative. In my experience, working class people do not consume Fox News, in a kind of hypnotized way. They consume things on social media.
Despite what Barack Obama thought,
Exactly. They'll read something on social media and they'll go, I wonder if that's true, and then go on with their day. Or if they tell you something that they saw and you say, actually, that's not true, they'll go, interesting. Yeah, I guess not everything on the internet is true. But try convincing, a liberal that Hamas's body count is not real. I mean, you're not going to get very far, right? So I think that's sort of the difference. Both are obviously like very morally abhorrent, but I feel that the right-wing anti-Semitism that's being introduced by people like Candace Owens does not have very far to spread, but that could be naive.
Well, obviously, as we always say, there's a rule in journalism: you never say never. So we don't know, but obviously, she has an audience, and somehow this is, playing. I think there are all kinds of different things on. I think Tucker sort of is the spiritual heir of Pat Buchanan, who was a little more open in his hostility to Israel than he has been. I think with Tucker, it's a little bit more than America only. I think there's a deep resentment of Israel and Israel's supporters, and I think that plays out. But, I think it's also interesting, and as I've written in the past, when he was on Fox, as sort of the tribune of American conservatism and a very important, figure, more important than I think even some of the people who demonized him on the left really understood. Between 8 and 9 p.m. on Fox News, Israel was the word that was never heard. He really downplayed his feelings about Israel because he knew that people who watch conservative media, by and large, are people who are friendly to Israel, who love Israel. More so than, the readers of the New York Times, especially, among American Jews. But at any rate, it's important, I think, to point out where journalism is failing. But the question remains, and that was sort of the last part of your book, how do we fix it? Especially if it's clear that the people that control our key media institutions have no incentive to change and are, in fact, doubling down on their efforts to divide us and amplify the most radical and often the most anti-Semitic voices because it's in their interest, because they profit from it. So how do we fix that?
I don't know that the media can be fixed, but I don't know that it matters. So I feel like it's probably not going to get much better, but I feel like it probably doesn't matter very much. The media has made itself very irrelevant by being both arrogant and amoral. And I think that irrelevance, people like to say, well, you can't have a democracy without a healthy fourth estate, but I don't know that that's true. I think people need to feel like they can get the information that they need. And when it comes to really important issues that affect people, like economics, or whatnot, even at times when the media was working, let's say, better or in a way that we would all consider to be more objective or more fair, people did not have the power to influence the things that actually made a difference to their lives. So, our problems with our democracy are much deeper and more fundamental than just the media being biased. If you were a person who worked in a factory in the late 70s, you were powerless over your destiny because of what was happening at a much greater scale than anything you would have ever consented to. And that's just a much bigger problem that we have, that I think is caused by the kind of reign of elites and the fact that, only people with a college degree get into Congress and get into, the media or any position of power, really. And, the vast NGO complex, which just funnels people into public policy from woke universities. So the problem, I think, is much bigger. The problem is not one of information. It's a problem of having been cut out of the conversation at all. And once people are, in my fantasy of how things go, my book comes out and is a bestseller and changes the world. But, I'm joking a little bit. Obviously, I want that to happen. But, the working class gets back on its feet because one side or the other starts to actually listen to what people want. And we start to sort of erode the situation we have now, where over half of the GDP belongs to the top 20%. And the professional managerial class is ruling everything and hoarding the American dream. And at that point, when the working class has that economic stability again to once again become a middle class, a thriving middle class that can then exercise political power, we will figure out how to get better information to the people who need it. Right now, they just don't need it because they can't do anything with it. And that's why it's dying.
Well, I think that's a fair point. I'll push back a little bit in that, you're right. Most people don't ignore the media in many ways. Certainly most ordinary working class Americans, they're not dependent on, they're not looking to the New York Times op-ed page, to decide how to live their life or what to think. And yet, the ability of sort of cultural elites, the people who, sort of write the jokes on the late night comedy shows, and and who staff Congress and who fill, the jobs in the government and who are in media, they do have the power to help make us more divided. They are driving this division. And, I think, we're about to head in. We're already in the middle of the election cycle, but we're about to head into an election, which is, I tremble to think, I think about the possible outcomes in 2024. And no matter which way it goes, I tremble for the country because of the way the media and the cultural elites are pushing, the narrative of near civil war. What happens if Trump wins? What happens if he doesn't win? It's sort of, the consequences of this increased polarization, I think, go beyond, just the New York Times being biased and, stupid and, us having, and the culture dying, I think there are real possible consequences of the people sort of beating the drums for this bifurcated culture and leading us to who knows what. I really have no idea what will happen. Right now the polls say Trump, is leading, he's winning. It's a year from now, so who knows? Any act of God could take, both Trump or Biden out. But I still wonder, with this media, with this culture, how are we going to accept, the result of the election, no matter what happens? So I think the media does play a part in that.
Well, the first time around, Trump won, and they organized the Women's March, and then most of the ire after that was focused on him. And then Biden won, and there was January 6th, and 1,000 people have been arrested and prosecuted for, misdemeanors and, some worse, some fairly, some less so. But we're okay, right? I mean...
Okay, yeah, we're both sitting here. They haven't locked us up.
Still here.
We can say what we want. We can publish. I'm not, but I'm not saying the world is going to end. But I do think that the division is getting worse. I think a few years ago, some of us noticed that every time we had a new president, it created a new derangement syndrome on the part of their political opponents, whether right or left.
Right.
And each derangement syndrome got worse. And now we're at the point where, again, the people who control the press, control the media, who profit from division, we're really much more divided. We're heading into I think we're heading into uncharted territory. I'm not saying the world is going to end. I'm not, I believe in American democracy. I believe it can survive Trump, Biden, the New York Times, either party, but I still worry that, we don't know the consequences of, when it really gets ramped up. That's my fear. So that's my pushback on you on that, to that extent.
I'll just give one example of why I feel a little bit more sanguine about this, I think. Have you noticed John Fetterman in the last few weeks?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So John Fetterman, he first came to my attention in the beginning of the, Pennsylvania Senate race. I thought, oh, this is kind of a cool guy. Like he's, seems to have a working class vibe. He goes to talk to these factory workers that, people seem to like him. He seems like a person who you can't imagine having contempt for you. He's like overweight and bald and like really nice. And, I could see why people like him, Then he had his stroke, and I felt so sorry for him, but it seemed unthinkable that a person who was suffering the way that he was would be sent to the Senate. I mean, it just seemed insane. Like a party that cared about this country, cared about this man, couldn't possibly send him to Washington. And he performed in that debate against Dr. Oz. Everybody thought it was over for him, except for Trump, by the way. Trump apparently watched the debate and people were saying, oh, he's finished. And Trump said, no, people are going to vote for him because they're going to feel sorry for him. And he was right, because he has really good political instinct.
Right.
Anyway, he goes to the Senate, and I started to like really dislike him. He would do this like Twitter trash talking, trolling of people in a way that I thought was really immature. And he seemed to me to embody the kind of like cry bully AOC thing where like you attack, and then when people call you out on it, you get kind of, you know, self-defensive and, you know, weepy and feel sorry for yourself and so forth. And of course, you know, I'm talking about after he came out, you know, he struggled with mental health. He came out, he seemed to get it together. But I developed this like real dislike for him, like for his demeanor, the whole wearing the shorts and the hoodie on the halls of the Senate, like the need to be seen as like so different. And so, you know, I started to develop this dislike for him. And then the most amazing thing happened. Like this horrible thing happened in Israel, Black Sabbath. And suddenly John Fetterman ties an Israeli flag around his neck and walks right through the protesters. And he was at an event, and somebody started, you know, interrupted the event, started saying, why won't you call for a ceasefire? And Fetterman looks at me and goes, I had a stroke. Didn't you hear? I don't understand anything you're saying. Next question, you know? And, you know, there's footage of him like walking through protests, calling for a ceasefire, and from the river to the sea. And, you know, he's a very big man. And there's this very charming video of him waving a very tiny little Israeli flag. And he hung up every single poster of every single kidnapped person. As everybody was tearing them down, he was putting them up. And now he's been moving them across the room, every single one who's been returned. And I mean, I can't even describe like the flip-flop in my heart for this guy. Like to see him take on the most unpopular position in his coalition, in his natural, you know, space, which is the Progressive Caucus, like knowing that they are going to judge him and hate him, and he has lost all of his allies in that corner, and doing it purely for principle, the way that I think President Biden really has. You know, it just, in these polarized times, I didn't know that my heart could flip on a dime like that for a person who I think is wrong about everything, who's like every political position he supports, I'm sure I think is totally dumb and destructive and corrosive and elitist and gross. It just like that thing in your heart where you see a person act out of principle, and it is undeniable, and it is just like it's so powerful. It's so powerful. And I don't think I'm a unique person. I think I'm like everybody else. And so when I see myself able, like I've definitely changed my mind about Donald Trump, for example, but it took a very long time. It was a very slow, agonizing process. Like imagine tearing off a Band-Aid, but like for 2 years, you know? That's what it felt like. But this was just like on a dime. And I think that there's probably a lot of people like me who are just waiting to see an act of principle. And that will bring us back to the center.
Yeah, well, that's a great example. And, you know, I think you're absolutely right. You know, Fetterman was somebody, I think, you know, sort of an upper class kid cosplaying as a working class guy. And, you know, with a lot of really ideological positions, and then basically having his staff and family lie about his condition in order to get him elected. Yet he turns around and moves to the center, at least on this one issue, and does so in a way that challenges, you know, the people that voted for him. So, yes, on that very optimistic note, there is hope for America. I think I still believe in America, and maybe of all people, John Fetterman is a reason to continue hoping. Anyway, Batya, thanks so much for joining us today. If you haven't already read it, do read her Bad News. It's still the best book out there on how media bias works. And follow her on @Ungar-Sargon. I also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.